Joining me now, Representative J.T. Wilcox of Yelm. Representative Wilcox, thank you for your time today. Let's start with just your broad overview. What do you see as the major takeaways from the 2022 legislative session?
Well, I think there's some major disappointments. First of all, there was a huge surplus left in the general fund, about 10 times greater than has been the record in the past, around $15 billion over 4 years, and almost every dime was spent, and almost none of it was sent back to the taxpayers. We think that there was a big opportunity to really reset the way that we do things in Washington, and instead it was all spent, and not spent in a strategic direction, but funding a bunch of new programs, expanding old ones, and that I think is something that we're going to regret in the future when the economy is not quite so good. The other disappointment, I think, has to do with the other major budget that we do in Washington, and that is transportation. Traditionally, transportation has been a very bipartisan approach. They're often passed with a unanimous vote, and packages of new investment have been worked out with people from clear across the state, and in the end, even the revenue has been broadly agreed upon. And even though my seatmate, Andrew Barkis, who is our House Republican lead on transportation, rolled out a major new package that didn't require any new taxes in December, he was kept completely out of the negotiation. In fact, he saw the package that was proposed by the two Democratic chairs about 10 minutes after the press availability had started. That's a sad break with tradition, and I don't think that it sets a good example for the future.
Has the relationship between the two parties within the legislature changed? And if so, how has it changed?
Well, I think the fact that there have been very little face-to-face interactions has been bad for relationships, you know, in every single way. We've got a number of freshman legislators that had not ever met each other until about the last week of the session when the rules eased up, and I think it's a lot easier to be partisan, and it's also, much more importantly for the people of Washington, I think, a lot easier to just decide I don't need any other input when you're not looking at anybody across the table face to face, you're not breaking bread with them, you're not creating human relationships. And so I think, I always tell people, COVID makes everything that wasn't perfect 10 times harder. I think it made legislating 10 times harder, and it reduced the quality of what we do.
The Deputy Majority Leader of the Senate Democratic Caucus, Senator Manka Dhingra, addressed the issue of bipartisanship and one-sided or the idea that the Democratic caucuses were not including Republicans by saying that the vast majority of the legislation that comes out of the legislature that is passed on a typically wide bipartisan vote. Do you disagree with that assessment?
Well, I would disagree with the conclusion. First of all, it's true and always has been that the less important and the less contentious things pass, you know, just as a matter of common sense and agreement. For example, it wasn't that hard to get near unanimous votes on making pickleball the state sport. But that's not a very critical thing. The example that I gave a little bit earlier, something like $14 billion transportation revenue package that's going to affect the whole state over the next 5 or 6 years and much longer in terms of the impact of the construction, being done completely behind closed doors with no input at all from the people that represent about 45% of Washington, that's a problem.
What do you see as the major conflicts within the transportation package? What areas would you have done differently?
Well, first of all, the revenue part of that, in the end, after they tried 3 or 4 different fund grabs from various revenue sources in Washington, they actually had to go back to something that was closer to Andrew Barkis's idea, which is we've got this big surplus in our general fund, let's use that. What I wish they would have done is just permanently switched some or all of the revenue that comes to us from sales tax on cars and trucks and other transportation assets and dedicated that to construction and maintenance of our existing transportation assets. That, I think, would have been a chance to really reset the way that we do things, because everybody knows that it's not going to be possible with gas tax in the future. But instead, they took dollars from the general fund, but didn't dedicate them, so that we're going to have this same debate in just a few years. The other thing that would have happened if we would have had a normal negotiation is the people that are involved in the parts of the state that are not Central Puget Sound would have had a chance to advocate for the transportation that everybody that's not in Central Puget Sound can access. So many of the things that get built with this package are important for the economy. I don't deny that. But in many, many cases, the investments that are made are going to benefit people here. And if you happen to live in the 2nd District, where I do, in the little town of Yelm, for example, or in Eastern Washington, or in the Olympic Peninsula, you will never see these things, and you may not have had anybody in that room advocating for the often very tiny little projects that would change life and maybe even make life much safer in a small town.
I want to talk about the Emergency Powers Reform Bill. The Speaker was asked about that and said that the reason that it didn't come back up for a vote was that when the issue was on the floor, it was clear that Republicans were going to make a lot of speeches, and that they considered it a time-sensitive situation. So they approached you, said, would you rather vote or do you want to make speeches? And according to them, came back and said, we want to talk about it, we want to make speeches. Is that accurate? And if so, why?
Well, let me set the context a little bit. There is about a week where you can pass bills from the opposite house or the House of Origin. You have these different cutoffs here. And there's lots of time. At least half of the time that we are supposedly on the floor, we're just sitting around waiting to hear what bills the majority is going to run. So to say that it wasn't cutoff day, that there was a shortage of time, I don't think is accurate. It came up at about, I think, 1 a.m. The day before the cutoff, I think. And there were several amendments, 4 amendments. It wasn't an excessive number of amendments. And of course, we wanted to try to persuade the other side to listen to these amendments that would make this limitation on emergency powers more effective. It's funny, I was not even actually paying attention to the debate at the moment when the 2 individuals you're talking about came over. And I don't think that they should present that choice to me, where if you talk, we're going to kill the bill. That isn't what representative democracy is all about. It's about having a debate, trying to convince people. And we've had 2 years of emergency powers. Isn't it reasonable that the representatives of the people have, I don't know, an hour or 2 to talk about that rather than 20 or 30 minutes?
We've got just about 2 minutes left here. Let's talk about housing. What's your perspective on the legislative, on the bills that actually made it out of the legislature related to housing affordability?
Well, that's a huge disappointment to me. Before the session, we agreed that one of the, in fact, often the major concern for people in the state of Washington is that A, we have a shortage of housing, and B, the housing that we have is unaffordable for many people. And I think there was kind of broad agreement that there's about 250,000, there's a shortage of about 250,000 homes. That's 250,000 families that don't have a place to live, that should have a place to live. And I gave the same speech probably 4 or 5 times this year as we passed bills. Isn't it a tragedy that instead of passing a bill that would make it less complicated and less expensive to build any kind of housing, we're passing bills that make it more expensive and more complicated in terms of regulation to build that housing? I think that was a total failure on the part of the legislature. There was one bill that died. It was controversial. It wasn't perfect, but I passed the message on that we had 20 votes in the Republican caucus to at least advance it. It was the missing middle bill. At least advance it so that we can try to turn it into something that would work. And that one died without ever getting a floor vote.
What, if you could pick one bill that you think will make the biggest impact on everyday life for all Washingtonians, what bill which either passed or didn't pass? Well,
I think the most impactful 2 bills that you have every year is a transportation budget and a general funds budget. You know, the fact that we had a package this year, those are going to be impactful. They could have been more effective and more impactful, but they are going to make a big impact on the future of Washington. And the general fund spending $15 billion over 4 years, returning none of it, that's A, a big impact, and B, a big missed opportunity.
10 seconds left. Closing thoughts?
Well, I appreciate being here. I'm looking forward to a much wiser and impactful session in 23.
Thank you very much. Again, House Republican Leader J.T. Wilcox, we do appreciate your time.